Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Crossroads series podcast. My name is Bradley Ottesen, and I'm the violist of the Fry Street Quartet. We are the co-music directors of the Nova Chamber Music series in Salt Lake City and the string quartet in residence with the Kane College of the Arts at Utah State University. Nova recently hosted the online film premiere of the Crossroads Project, a multidisciplinary performance exploring sustainability. Our partner in this collaboration is Dr. Rob Davies. Dr. Davies is here today. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Brad. Thanks a bunch. Yes, I'm Rob Davies. I'm a professor of physics at Utah State University. I focus on global change and critical science communication. And as Brad mentioned, I am co-creator of the Crossroads Project, Rising Tide, along with my friends, the Fry Street Quartet. First, let me just thank the Nova Chamber Music Series and Utah State University Kane College of the Arts for their major support in producing this film that Nova is making available for free. And there are a bunch of other folks we'll thank as well. We'll tag at the end of the show. So let's just start with a recap. As Brad said, the Crossroads Project is a performance project, a performance science project. And if you've watched the film, you know it blends science and imagery and music, exploring the wonders of how our island planet, as we call it, makes human civilization possible, and the structures of human civilization that are threatening our natural foundations. If you haven't seen the film, you can watch it for free on YouTube, again, thanks to Nova, and we'll post a link for that. So the performance weaves together these themes of water and life and food and people. And these podcasts are intended to give us some additional room to explore these stories in their own right, more room than we have in a 70-minute film, and also the telling of these stories in this way. And so today, what we're doing is delving into Act 2, which is BIOS, which looks at the foundational rules of Earth's living systems, the biosphere. And to help us do that, we've invited both scientific and artistic voices to the conversation. Speaking of whom, let's introduce them now. Brad, who do we have with us?
Well, our first guest is a good friend of the Fry Street Quartet. John Shivik is an applied ecologist based here in Logan, Utah. He's a rugged outdoorsman, but also a great lover of the arts. So we regularly see him at concerts and other of our arts events here at USU. Welcome, John.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And we also have with us Rebecca Allan, a visual artist, painter, who has been also a great friend of the Crossroads Project and the Fry Street Quartet and myself, and has been with this project from its inception over 8 years ago now. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi, thank you so much.
Well, thank you both for being here. John, we want to start with you. And would you be willing to tell us just a little bit more about yourself, your personal background, your work, and your areas of interest and study?
Yes, I guess I have a somewhat of a long history and varied history, dipping myself into different aspects of biology as a wildlife management major. I started to get interested in wildlife, and then realized all too quickly that the management of wildlife is largely about the management of people. And learned as I went that I wanted to try to live in that space between people and wildlife. So I became a researcher, worked at the university for about a decade, and specialized in human-wildlife conflicts, especially between humans and predators, coyotes, bears, wolves, those kinds of things. And then I thought I was really an applied ecologist. I thought I was really applied. I moved into working for the state as a state biologist and as a federal land manager. So I've done everything from living in the ivory towers to jumping right into the trenches and watching things actually happen. So that's led me along this path. And I have to admit, one of the brightest points has been the development of these kinds of collaborations, this Crossroads effort. The art that you guys have brought have really kind of kept me afloat on some of those hard days. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh.
And you've written a couple of books, haven't you?
Oh, yes, yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to do as I went along is share this knowledge and get it out there. So I wrote an initial book called The Predator Paradox, which is exactly about how to live with predators and the relationship humans have with them. And then I also delved into a book on animal personality and individuality in animals as a way of getting that knowledge. And just one of the main themes of that book, and I think an important thing about probably some of our discussion today, is just how important personality, individuality is, and what each of us brings as an individual into these types of conversations. And that's largely what that book's about, but it's about animals.
John's a great writer. These books are very engaging, and the language is fun.
Oh, thanks, Brad.
So I want to go from that to another question about the Crossroads Project. You're based here in Logan, and you've been sort of with the Crossroads Project from the beginning. You saw one of the very early versions before we even had original music written for the Crossroads Project. And then you saw the unveiling of Laura Kaminsky's wonderful score, which also pulled Rebecca Allan into the project. So you sort of saw the full unveiling of the Crossroads Project in 2012, and you've seen it evolve since then to the film version, which we just premiered in 2020. Could you just talk a little bit about your experience with the Crossroads Project through all of these manifestations?
Well, the easiest thing is, how lucky am I? Like I said, your art, and I've been a fan of the Quartet for a number of years, and I really appreciated what you guys have done. The original, this is a number of years ago. There's a lot of the aspects of the original that have changed, and it's been neat to see how it's progressed and how you've shaved things and added things and really made it bigger. The artwork, Rebecca's art, and some of the other artwork has really expanded it. The score, I love Kaminsky's score now, especially Water. I love that first movement. It's wonderful. But some of the things that I remember in the original that you guys dropped out, and I think I even complained to Rob at one point about it, you had a little more, and I realize it's a difficult thing to do, but you did have a little more, tried some humor, tried some levity in it. When that original performance, the music, of course, was beautiful. Rob, your delivery is great. But boy, I felt a real sense of despair coming out of it. And it's been nice. I love the way you really moved it along this time now, and end with, you know what, John, you don't have to solve everything. We just all need to come to the table and bring something little. And between that element of it, the humor thing, the part I really loved in the 2012 original version, do you remember this, Brad, is it was about how we would work together, right? And as a funny little segment of what happens in a quartet if the violinists decide that they're going to play aggressively, whereas the violist and cellist play less aggressively. It was something along those lines. And it was really subtle, somewhat comical, but also just gave you a little bit of a gut punch of, yeah, we got to be all on the same page. Even though you guys were playing the same music, just the emphasis really changed the way it played. And it was amusing, but also instructional too.
Yeah, we had some acting in that early.
Yes, oh, you were actors. That's right. It was beautiful.
We basically used the quartet as a living metaphor, which is something we often do at chamber music workshops when we're teaching people how to play chamber music. Sometimes when we're teaching people who aren't musicians about chamber music, we sort of have these series of scenario that we play out on stage, which what happens if we're not working together? What happens if somebody tries to take control, absolute control of the situation? What happens if somebody is just completely it's a little silly, but we felt like there was something there to say.
Yeah, I mean,
eventually that sort of worked its way out of the performance.
I know it did, but I mean, that's not a stretch. You guys are all coming with your own view of how it should be played, I'm sure, and you want more viola, and but the other thing is, I do have to say this, and I was hooked, just even that first performance. Like I said, I like how it's developed, but just as a scientist and as an applied scientist and wanting to reach out and really interested in things like diversity, I thought, Rob, it was so brilliant to bring art and science together that way, to really try to meld these things. And I often say that, new science, advances in science come through innovation, and innovation is an artistic thing, not a scientific thing.
I love that.
Yeah. So what you guys do is you bring other elements, you bring other personalities, right? You bring other people to the table to enlarge in that mixing box. So we get that diversity of thought and opinion and artistry and how to express it, right? So much of it's just how you're expressing these things. And I was hooked just right at the beginning. It's like, oh, you guys are on to something. And it's just been lovely to watch this develop.
Well, appreciate that, John. These creative types are just really pesky. As you bring them into a project, and then they really want to do their thing. They're just not doing what you tell them to. They're just
Creative types.
Types.
They're like creative orientation.
She's air quoting, by the way.
I want to comment real quick, John. So, Brad, and this is for you too, Brad. I've had a number of people tell me that they really missed that bit with the quartet, where you were, like you said, this living, breathing metaphor for what goes wrong when you don't collaborate. I remember when we finally decided to jettison that bit, the quartet, you guys were all happy to lose it. Because acting, I think is probably your least comfortable bit, although you've all become quite good in the project. But it's the scientists, interestingly, that have been the most interested in that bit, and they really wanted to keep that. And I got chewed out by more than a couple of people for pulling that out. Well, that's fabulous. So let's shift over. Rebecca now also has been with the project from the beginning as an actual collaborator, and the notion was, in my mind, is so the reason we want to bring the artists into it is because they're master storytellers. You're not just giving information. You're setting a mood. You're opening a space for people to take it in a very visceral and emotional level. How we really connect with information.
Yeah.
And of course, the project, for those who've seen the film, there are many photographs in the presentation, and many of them are really quite extraordinary photographs and very artistic in their own right. But it's explicit information. We're showing a picture of tar sands or a picture of a polar bear, lots of wildlife, etc. And so it's kind of clear what role such an imagery would play in a project like this. But we specifically wanted you to bring in your paintings, which are not explicit, they're abstract. And I'm wondering if you might describe what role those bring to the performance, and also how you approached curating from your work for these different segments of the performance.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to talk about that. Well, I just want to start with the word abstract or abstraction, because the etymology of that word has to do with drawing something out, drawing out an essence, or extracting or pulling out the deepest flavor of, let's say, a plant material or an herb in order to make a spice. And so in painting with an abstract gesture, you are doing the same thing. My source material is as clear as a photograph of a mountain that Garth Lenz might take. The original subject that I'm thinking about might be a mountain or a river in the Pacific Northwest. But if I'm working with an abstract language, what I'm trying to do, and it's not always a clear line from A to B, but what I'm trying to do is pull out and find the most meaningful colors, forms, textures, and shapes that would allow you as a viewer to experience something of the essence of that place, landscape, subject. And I think in relation to what we've been trying to do with the work of the Crossroads Project, and that was really catalyzed by Rob Davies' intention around it, is to invite our audiences to find a pathway into this difficult reality of climate change. And I remember conversations that centered on how far do you go with presenting images or material that is troubling and difficult to swallow. So abstract language provides a kind of a cushion for entering into this difficult subject matter. And it's not just subject matter that's out there, it's our own sense of dread, disempowerment, guilt, concern for the devastation that we see around us as a result of environmental damages.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a fabulous description. And since we're kind of focusing on this bios section, so we had the water section. This is this bit talking about life. And when you curated from your paintings for this section, you picked this series of tondos, one of which you're wearing on your sweater.
Yeah.
Or an example of which, I should say. And another example of which is hanging on your wall behind you. So could you tell us a little bit about what a tondo is and why it is you, with this, vignette, this bios vignette, why you went that direction?
The tondo as a form in painting goes back centuries, but it was used in the early Renaissance as a shape of a plate, as a birth plate in the late medieval times and early Renaissance. So women would receive these beautiful ceramic plates that were in the shape of a tondo, that were a kind of marker of the anticipation of the birth of a child. So they have this wonderful reference to Italian Renaissance culture, and also in the High Renaissance, we see the tondo form used often in Raphael's paintings, in some of Michelangelo's paintings. And when I went to Italy and I saw the Pantheon, John Shivik might know this building. In the ceiling of the Pantheon is a dome with an oculus, which is open to the sky. So you can sit under the oculus and get rained on, and you can perceive the movement of the sky as it moves across the building. And I thought that would be a wonderful shape to explore as a painting ground. And in fact, that has become, in some of my work, that has become both the earth as seen from space and the ground. But there's no horizon line. And so it presents interesting challenges in terms of thinking about issues of orientation, the earth, where we live, what we see and what we can never see. And also it presents ideas about disorientation and immobility, because you don't have a horizon line that's anchoring you, and you could go on and spin forever. So we chose, I think, Rob, when we were figuring some of these early sequences out about the bios movement, we did center on those tondos, and many of them had either elements of water and plant material embedded, not physically, literally embedded in them, but conceptually embedded in them. So I felt like it was a magical moment that we found that way of working together. And because of the elements of soil, water, plants, and sky and weather that are embedded conceptually in those paintings. I mean, we had been thinking about these things, all of us, separately before we came together. So that circle brought us together too.
Oh, what a fabulous way to put it. Yeah.
Came together.
Well, it's really wonderful that we can see an example of one of the paintings right behind you. In in the performance or in the film, they take on a whole nother form, and they sort of change the whole atmosphere of the room. But in those cases, we're talking about like a digital projection, sometimes like 10 times the original size, extremely luminous, projected
Right.
onto like a 30-foot screen.
Yeah.
What is it like to see one of your paintings, which is conceived in one form, and see it sort of transformed and used in another setting like that?
Well, and before you
Go
answer
ahead.
that, Rebecca,
Yeah, I'm listening.
I
I'm
just
gonna
wonder. No, this
go
is a
ahead.
great question, and I just wonder if maybe we've got some images that we can throw up.
She's gonna make it that big. She's Rebecca, she's pulled it off the wall.
She's pulled it off the wall.
All right.
It's performance. This is wonderful.
So we've got some. Well, we've got some images that from the performance that we could throw up, just so for those who haven't seen the performance and are watching this visually, we can just throw some of these up. And so here's an example, I think, of what, Brad, that you're talking about. This is one of those tondos, and it's much bigger than the original.
Yeah.
And it's also being in the performance. It actually gets built in bit by bit. It doesn't. You don't see it all at once.
Right.
Here's another one.
Yeah.
And this is in the process of this very slow dissolve between that image and some lichen on a tree. And if we freeze this image for just a second, you can see the lichen in the background image that's dissolving away is really adding some extra texture to the painting.
Right.
And then if we go forward one more,
Yep.
what struck me about this is I expected that when that background image went away, the texture would go away, but in fact it doesn't. It's really, to my eye, really highlighted. So there's an example of what Brad was saying. And Brad, your question was, well, maybe repeat your question.
Well, what is it like to see something that you conceived one way transformed in such a dramatic fashion? And, in more ways than one, it also turns out tangentially that a tondo is the perfect shape for a CD. And so that's also what our album looks like. It's the artwork of one of your tondos. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got a signed copy of one of those too. It's beautiful.
Well, I feel like again, the use of that lichen photograph that emerges in and out of the image of the painting, I got excited about that because I felt like it helps audiences make that more direct connection to the observed world that they might know. I mean, in John's world of what animals see when they walk around the forest and they're looking down at moss. They could even help us understand what animals see that's between the human and other species. So this thing that you did is kind of an interspecial work in a way. And it's okay with me. I mean, I have to make a painting that's going to stand up on its own as an artist. If I'm working by myself and I want to please myself and be consistent with my own ambition. But if I'm collaborating with you, then that's a whole other game. And I feel that it works, it just works in that way. And I'd like to talk more about that as we talk with audiences after the film and how they perceive that. One thing that I felt like was multiplied in the film version that really surprised me is when the image is across the whole screen and the filmmaker gets close to the musician and you see the musician's face right against, like against the canvas like this, that does something even better because that sets the musician, the artist into an environment, or you into the environment much more directly. And it's almost like a set design. Mm-hmm. It's more of a set. It becomes a kind of set design.
And it is something you don't get in a live performance. That happens in the film. I
Yeah.
wonder if you could roll the second clip that we had teed up, which is a really good illustration of what Rebecca was just saying. And as we stand before this great, complex, and adaptive biosystem, who among us identifies the pieces that are not needed?
Okay, that was
Yeah. Just one thought that popped up is that last summer, no, not last summer, this is a couple years ago, I started working with the Kentucky Natural Lands Trust as an advisor. And the Kentucky Natural Lands Trust is working to preserve the Pine Mountain Greenway. That blended image reminded me of the lichens and the slime mold that you find in some of the most diverse ecosystem in the world on Pine Mountain in southeastern Kentucky. So it's like, is it abstract or is it completely realistic? It's both.
That's such a great example of how everything melded. Like you're saying, Rebecca, too, with nature and art, but also, I got to tell you, just listening to that clip and watching that clip, I'm feeling my heart elevate as you are just really leading into it. And then going calm. Oh, and I love the earthiness of those instruments, Brad.
Oh my God.
They sound
Brad.
so wonderful.
Yeah.
And then those soft final notes, and the visual bleeds perfectly in with the music. So the editing, everything was done just really well. And I end up calm. You know what I mean? It starts, you get angst, and then you, breathe. And it was really nice. Well done.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about that. I was going to ask you because, for those who are listening and not watching, that the music is just standing alone in this case. So I wanted to ask you your reaction. I mean, that movement has quite an arc to it. It sort of starts very mysterious at the beginning, very quiet, and you can imagine these disparate elements, molecules, and amoebas starting to come together and form something greater. And then it builds and it builds, and to me, it gains some tension. Also, it's you can almost sense like the competition for resources, like there's a desperation of sort of a magnificent desperation towards the top, and then it sort of breaks, and then we have this sort of resolution and resolve towards the end of the movement.
And of course,
from a musician's perspective, that's what the movement says to me.
And of course, all of this, what you just articulated, John and Brad and Rebecca, is the actual heart of the conception of telling this story this way. So rather than just a science lecture, adding these additional elements that affect us all quite deeply. And so maybe this is a good place to transition and say that, okay, but also at its heart in this performance is delivering some information. Much of the information is just wondrous and fascinating. Some of it is also very difficult emotionally. But at the heart it's information that we need to take in and and demands a response, really, or should demand a response, and that's maybe the purpose of the performance, is to get that from us. So we've been talking about the music and the paintings. Let's go back to the information, and I want to roll our second clip, John, and then it's delivering science, but distilled, highly distilled. And then the question, of course, is, well, how did we do? Planet Earth, planet water, planet life. So much life. Ancient, diverse, everywhere. More than 1 million species we know about, millions upon millions we really don't. The sheer variety. This biodiversity is breathtaking. Woven into tapestries of living systems, ecosystems, life and environment interacting, interdependent, inseparable. It is the essence of life on our island planet. Earth species not separate from their environment or each other, but arising from their environment together. They self-assemble like a snowflake, reform their environment, and are themselves reformed, evolved through environmental selection. An evolution, though, not of millions of separate species, but co-evolution of millions of connected components of a vast, self-assembling, self-repairing, self-governing, complex and adaptive biosystem. And unknowing as we are of most of its components and how they're connected, we understand this biosystem but a little. Of the millions of things to understand, we understand approximately 5. Because these are life's most basic operating principles, nature's paradigms, and they are clear and visible everywhere. Number 1. Well, if you want to know the 5, you got to watch the film. So John, as a scientist, though, taking in that monologue, what do you think?
Well, in the context of that monologue and the one before it, you had mentioned, I don't remember the Leopold quote exactly, but regarding when you're tinkering with complex mechanisms, the first rule is to keep all the pieces, right?
Right.
And you really almost sort of paraphrased and just built on that. I thought that was a wonderful point to make, and to bring it home. I love that language with the snowflake.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, wasn't that a great image?
Yeah.
That was really, really neat. The science part, though, this is interesting. This is, if there's anything I'm conflicted a little bit in the science, is that one of the difficulties as I've had on my whole career is this acceptance of uncertainty, this embracing of uncertainty. And a lot of, whether it's a scientific article or this project, you come across that we've got this many million species out there, but then there's flip numbers of, then we're losing all these animals. But then there's a certain element of, I don't know, maybe this is more about me and my approach to science, and saying up front that there's a lot we don't know. And by saying what we don't know doesn't mean we shouldn't care, right? Ignorance is no excuse for complacency. And if anything, it presents a little more urgency and practicalness, that there's a lot out there. It's a complicated thing. I do like how, you mentioned this is a self-assembling, self-fixing thing. And the irony here that maybe doesn't come home to a lot of folks is that, and I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but I mean, the Earth doesn't care if we're on it or not. If we shake ourselves off of our own, only it's one, not 1.7 planets, right? It's our one planet. If we shake ourselves off of it, the world doesn't care. It's tragic. It's terrible. It's all those things, but there's a certain element of, I don't know, it's even bigger, as much as you're trying to address in this, I think a lot of the questions are still even bigger of, who are we? Why are we here? How are we going to stay here? And how are we going to live with ourselves as we stay here?
Wow, that really hits me.
Oh, I hope in a good way.
Yeah. Yeah.
In your introduction, John, you talked a little bit about your work and exploring the borders, about sort of living in that zone between man's world and nature's world. I mean, the Crossroads Project is interesting. It explores the borders between disciplines, and
that's why I love it.
Borders between art and science. That's sort of an interesting connection. But as somebody who really spends a lot of time in between worlds, is there anything that you'd like above all to communicate that you wish everyone would know?
Okay,
or think about more.
Yeah.
More in their daily life or their conception of the.
Okay, that's great. It's a wonderful question. Here's the thing, and I think a lot of it, I usually explain this is because maybe I'm a middle child or something, and I just want us all to get along and find that place, right? But Rebecca, that this is, and a lot of your other work that you do too, we're gardening. I was talking with Rob earlier about my garden, how proud I am of having my garden. And not to be so utilitarian about the earth, but it's our garden, right? And for me, going out, getting my hands dirty, hurting my back, bending over, putting up, I put up my plums and pears, and I had 80 pounds of tomatoes this year. It was wonderful.
Wow.
I know, right? It's a lot of work.
Amazing.
But that's our guy. So you could either look at this this is a sacrifice. Oh no, we've got to save the planet. It's going to be so hard. Or you can look at it, we're gardening.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And I think I was hoping that would resonated with you a little bit, Rebecca, because that's you're designing landscapes. We're designing where we want to go, and it's work.
Oh yeah, it's work. Gardening is not for sissies. It is for sissies.
It is, right?
Too. I'm a sissy, and I also would like to be known, as Brad described you, as a rugged visual artist. But there's nothing like planting tomatoes or growing apple trees that brings you in direct contact with the plant and animal and insect kingdom so directly. And you feel its strength and its power and its capacity to shake you off the earth. And you also feel the capacity to cooperate with it. I know Brad is also, and Rob and Rebecca are avid gardeners. So we're all sort of involved in this practice. But it's funny because when you were talking about John, you were talking about the fact that there are a lot of bigger questions out there that have to do with our relationship to what we're doing here, and admitting to ourselves that the earth doesn't care if we stay here. Then if that's the case, what are we going to do with our one little life? Right. And the Crossroads, these relationships, these friendships, have really catalyzed my decision to go back to school for horticulture. And I've never felt more hopeful when I am doing the kinds of things that you just described in the garden, mulching, turning the soil, because there's something, maybe you can explain this, you scientists, there's actually something that's biochemical that happens when you smell the soil. And it works on your nervous system and your brain. And I think there's something about the question you asked, the bigger question of who are we, what are we doing here, that's answered in that nonverbal experience of that transmission of information from the soil and from the air.
Well said.
I'm trying to think more about that. I'm thinking more about that.
No, that's wonderful. Good. I'm glad.
Yeah, it's sort of the Crossroads Project. Right in front of you. It's water and it's bios and it's forage and it's even societas. I would say I kind of consider my garden as both a form of peaceful protest
I
and
love that.
and therapy.
Yeah.
So
Great.
here we are in Logan. I live in a pretty suburban, like sort of a manicured neighborhood on the foothills of these rugged mountains, and so
Right.
the norm in my neighborhood is to have a green, all-American golf course sort of lawn. And what I've focused on is tearing all of that out and putting in water-wise landscaping, because we do
Yeah.
have a sort of an addiction to residential water usage here
Mhm.
in Utah. We overuse the water.
Mhm.
We use more than we should. And there aren't that many people in my neighborhood that have gone this route. And so people are really curious about it. They
Mhm.
stop all the time and want to talk about it. It opens up a conversation. And I always talk about the reason why I do this is to save water and to provide forage and habitat for species who need it a little more than they have.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've also become a gardener. It's sort of a reluctant gardener at first, but it turned out that it was something I needed. I didn't even know. I didn't even know that I needed it.
Wow.
I love how you said it that way too.
Yeah.
Where it's like we're living. What you're doing is you're choosing things that you can grow. I've got friends and colleagues drive by and say, "Oh, that's John's house. He's the one with the big sagebrush, in the front yard." We're just working with what we have, and again, it's not. It is nice, isn't it? And I planted it shortly after I moved in, probably 18 years ago or so. But we're working with what we have, and again, it doesn't mean everything. I still, I've got to water. I've still got to do some other things. We're living we're in northern Utah here, and it's pretty dry. But it's kind of that medium place. Again, it's the way that this project, this Crossroads, ends a little more hopeful. Is that we don't have to tear down my house and put in what would be just a sagebrush field in order to still contribute something, right? In order to still be a part of it, in order to still kind of get back to understand what you like about nature. So you don't have to live in a loincloth to be part of nature. And Rebecca, like what you're saying, just bending over, getting your hands dirty, and it's okay. My point though, I think what I really want to get to is, it's okay to hurt. Right? Practice hurts, Brad. Like there's days I bet you don't want to pick that instrument up and do it, or pick up the paintbrush or whatever it is, or Rob, say, oh gosh, another math lab, whatever it is.
Oh yes, I pick up my mechanical pencil.
Exactly, and but it's worth it. That's the thing.
Yeah.
It's really worth it. We can contribute through little things, and there's a real sense of moving towards why it's worth it. Then. Falling into, as I talked about, the early Crossroads Project, you can either walk out with despair or you can walk out with hope, and realizing hope needs some work, right? Hope, it's that applied hope, right?
Yeah.
That's what you do with it. I'm an applied ecologist and applied hopeful person.
And John, I know you've worked in a number of different capacities since I've known you, but you really do live in that sort of border between worlds. So, your job is hard. Sometimes I remember once you told me that if everybody was a little bit mad at you, then you were doing your job pretty well, you thought.
Yeah,
because you're dealing with real policy issues and land use.
Right.
Yep, I know there's lots of questions, burning questions, but John, maybe you've asked to talk about this a lot the last few months, but what is your sense of, how do you explain your understanding of the relationship between the coronavirus and animal land and people land? Is that something that you've been asked? Because I've been thinking about it as you talk about these boundaries between the...
Yeah, not so much directly, but a lot of the discussion has been more about this interface between humans and animals, and how we're living with them and how we're intermixing with them. And so many of these diseases, they jump, right? Zoonotics, And so they'll jump from animal to people, and how we are interacting with these animals is something that we need to pay a lot of attention to. So there's been a lot of discussion about that.
Mhm.
And then frankly, there's also been a lot of concern, bats. Bats are some of the coolest animals out there. And the last thing you want people doing is like, oh, bats, they're terrible. They harbor diseases that are going to kill us, and have a backlash against that.
Mhm.
So most of the discussion is just still forming now about how we manage this part of our relationship with us in the natural world, and then worried about backlash towards these animals.
Mhm. Thank you, John.
So a number of things have just come up, I think, that are play right into the story, of course, we're trying to tell, which is that everything's connected. And we have these very large emerging crises, climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, and social crises as well, massive accelerating inequity of the distribution of our wealth and resources as a society, massive unsustainability in the way that we conduct ourselves. And as I was listening to Brad talk about his interactions with his neighbors, and Rebecca and I, Rebecca McFall and I, in our home, have similar experiences with our neighbors because we're also doing something similar in our yard as Brad, you and Denise are. And so people talk and they want to talk about it. And I think a lot of times these examples and there are others around town, I think we all know where the cool yards are, what you would think of as the cool yards, that actually get people's imaginations going. And John, you mentioned early this notion of sacrifice and what is sacrifice versus just change. And I think oftentimes the notion of sacrifice, we view something as a sacrifice because it's a change. It's not something we're used to. And so John, in your work with predators too, I think, and we're speaking on a day, by the way, in which just yesterday, wolves were taken off the endangered species list, and now that this is going to have, I imagine, potentially huge impact on this, apex predator in a number of ecosystems. That we have these attitudes towards, let's say, predators for a particular reason, a big piece of which is the food system that we've built up, right? So here in the West, we have conflicts between, say, ranchers and predators, coyotes and wolves in particular, I imagine bears as well. And you can work on that on one level, assuming that nothing else is going to change, assuming that public attitude isn't going to change, assuming that our food system isn't going to change. But if you actually start working on more systems, Eisenhower had this great quote, if a problem is too big to be solved, make it bigger. And what he meant was you're probably not including enough pieces. So it might be interesting to know what that conversation in our society would be about predators if we were also moving away from a very meat-intensive food system, which, of course, lots and lots of research in terms of human sustainability says we need to do, because the current way we do it is just not sustainable. And so all of these things that we're working on, whether it's our yards in our suburban neighborhoods or our relationship to nature, often are hamstrung, I think, by our thought that these systems can't change. And I don't know. I'm going to throw that out there. I'll just let it flop. And did that stimulate any thinking among you? And
Well, one example of something that's challenging that entrenched feeling is, places like the New York Botanical Garden has this wonderful new program called the Edible Academy, which is a large physical area in the garden that is an outdoor classroom to teach young people and all people about growing food, even in an urban environment. And it's so successful, and it's such a magnet. And I think these are the kinds of things that started to come out of the seed saving efforts of indigenous peoples in the United States that have been going on for hundreds of years, that translated over to edible schoolyard programs and things like that. But that's, for me, that's a ray of hope.
You might be flopping into the next, was that the next segment there, on where you start with your carrot.
Right.
I thought you were going to say, "What's up, Doc?" to start. I was really surprised. No, but I think what you say there, and this is a really important point, Rebecca, is knowing where your food comes from.
Mhm.
And again, oh gosh, if there's any I don't want to seem wishy-washy about it, but I'm really not going to be hardcore black and white, my way, highway. You know what I mean? Even if you don't have to garden all your food to get an appreciation for food, right?
Yeah.
But frankly, you just can't buy a tomato like you can grow. That's one of the cardinal rules, I think, of life.
Except at the gardener's market.
Maybe at gardener's market. Yeah, perhaps. But then the other thing is too, I think of things like you talk about meat and meat production. I don't want to be black and white and say I mean, we'd be better off as Americans eating less meat. I think that's the case. But I want to go and say you can't have any meat ever, right? But I'd rather, my own philosophy on that is garden or meat. It's how you're getting it. I'd much rather be responsible. If I'm going to eat meat, then I've got to be the one to go harvest that meat. It's going to hurt. You got to draw it out. You got to work. It's really intense emotionally and physically to go through that process. But there's nothing better than, boy, an animal, free range animal, no antibiotics, none of that stuff, none of this, the rest of the complex that we have in the US, where we're creating fertilizers to, you're trucking fertilizers with fossil fuels to grow plants, to truck to Florida, to feed into feedlot. There's like all these series of steps that are creating inefficiencies that we don't have to have happen. And I think that's what a lot of the discussion is, it's not just yes or no, you can or you can't do this, but I think it's more the process of how we're doing these things and how we can do them more efficiently and more sustainably. And I hope in a way that we're more still connected with our environment and with our food. I mean, we live off of this planet, using the planet. How do we, it's so dangerous when we become so disconnected that we don't know where food comes from. That's maybe one of my biggest concerns.
Well, and certainly it's a point we make in the script that
Yes.
that this system is embedded in this larger natural world. It has to work.
Right.
It has to. So, our one example, of course, that gets used a lot, but I think is a really instructive, is roughly 30% of our food is pollinated by pollinators. And of course, there's kind of there's a definite crisis in pollinators, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And so here we find this human system of food production embedded within this much larger natural system. And ultimately, they will have to work. Ultimately, they will work together. I mean, we're headed towards a sustainable state, whether we like it or not. I mean, humanity will at some point be sustainable by definition. But most of the sustainable states we can imagine aren't particularly pleasant. And so well, we need to find our way to one that is a food system, for example, in this case that we're talking, that's embedded in this natural system, that's going to give us the food we want and enjoy, and there's no reason it can't.
Right. It comes down to the question we're talking about: is what do you want your garden to look like, right? This is our garden. This is where we live. What do we want it to look like? And hopefully, we can all agree that we want it a little prettier.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're running into the end of our time. John and Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us, and I think that's a lovely line to leave it with. What do we want our garden, our island planet to look like? Yeah. So thank you both so much for joining us and for being a part of this project. John, your thoughts are embedded in the current iteration of this performance because you've spoken to us over the years, and we take those things in and we make it. And the same with Rebecca, not just your paintings, but also your feedback.
Well, we thank you. You guys did all the work. Thanks for sharing it and just kind of bringing some great emotions and intellectual application here. It's wonderful to be a part of it and to experience.
Well,
I echo everybody's sentiments, and I just want to say thank you to everybody. And also just to mention that my Tondo pin with the eye was made by an artist named Ken Croken. It's not mine, but Ken's.
lovely. Well, and it is sort of great that we've rounded the corner into the next topic for the next podcast. So that'll be on forage,
Okay.
and we'll be out soon. So keep an eye open for that. Thank you once more to Rebecca and John for joining us.
Thank you.
Really,
Thank you.
really great conversation. And if you want to know more about the Crossroads Project, or if you want to watch the full-length film, visit www.novaslc.org. That's the webpage of the Nova Chamber Music Series. You can also donate if you appreciate the work that Nova has done to make the Crossroads film available to the public, and it will be up for viewing through the end of the year. So you can donate at that website. You can learn more about Nova's unique programming and find the full film, and also the individual podcast episodes, which we are halfway through now. Okay, and we'd also a lot of thank yous to close out. We would definitely like to thank our season sponsors, the Utah Legislature and the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, the Lawrence T. and Janet T. D. Foundation, Salt Lake County Zoo, Arts and Parks, George S. and Dolores Eccles Foundation, Isotope, Salt Lake City Arts Council, the Cultural Vision Fund, Dominion Energy, Rocky Mountain Power Foundation, the Alice M. Ditson Fund of Columbia University, and the Aaron Copeland Fund for Music. It takes a village. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you for the next episode.